Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bob Unger Show. We have a very good guest today who's going to educate us on something a little bit fundamental for every person, such as food and farming and what's happening and why, when you go to the store, for example, I took my wife to go shopping last week and she eats a lot of fruit. And we went to three different large supermarkets. One was ShopRite, one was King Cullen, and the other was Associated. And she went over to the managers and she said, I can't find any fruit. And they said, we're not getting deliveries. And people don't realize that even something in a land like the United States, where we've got so much farmland, we have to import food. Avocados come from Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to get into that with Brian Reisinger, who's the author of Land Rich, Cash Poor. And we're going to talk about farming. And Brian, give us a little bit of your background, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's good to be with you, Bob. Thanks for having me. I'm a fourth generation farmer's son. I grew up on a farm in the hills of southern Wisconsin, and we've been at it ever since my great grandpa first started our farm, and it passed from my great grandpa to my grandpa to my dad, and now my sister's working to take it over. And I'm just honored to tell our stories and help out with the farm as I'm able. And land rich cash poor, what it really does is it goes back through the hidden eras of history that are driving the disappearance of our farms. Why are our farms disappearing? What's the impact that's having? And then we weave that with our family story of survival through the Great Depression on up through today. Every farm family has stories of weather that blesses and threatens and tragic farm accidents and economic upheaval. And we try to tell that story in an honest way to try to shed light on these exact issues you're talking about, food security and all kinds of other problems that we have in our modern day.
I went to see 2 nights ago a woman named Catherine Austin Fitz give a speech.
Hmm.
She was in some high level positions in the government back in the 90s. And she was the assistant secretary of the housing and urban development. She also had positions in the treasury. And she laid out what she calls a digital concentration camp
Hmm.
that she happens to know is already planned. And one of the things she mentioned is if you try to buy non corporate food, your means of payment will be shut off in this digital prison that she's talking about.
Hmm.
And she even gave examples such as what they just recently passed called FASB 56, Financial Accounting Standards Board, which in effect says that national security is now more preeminent than financial transparency. So, in the name of national security, they will withhold any information they want and impose any controls they want. And then she showed a video of this big fat guy who's the head of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland.
Hmm.
And he's literally in your face bragging about how they are going to decide what you can buy, who you can buy it from, what you do with your money, and every control grid under the sun. And the average American knows as much as a sheep, or I should say, a turkey, before Thanksgiving. You know, the farmer smiles at the turkey, but he's got an axe behind his back, and he's been fattening the turkey, and the turkey is living off the fat of the land until that day comes when he gets his neck chopped off.
Right.
And that's kind of the position we're in. So relate your experiences in farming to some of these issues.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is, and it's still happening today, but the fact of the matter is that this country has been stamping out its farmers for decades. And it has been, I think what you're talking about boils down in one way to economic freedom. And economic freedom in this country is something that has been stifled and has been part of how we've stamped out our farmers. And it's also part of how we've removed choices for our consumers. So from the 1920s to today, we've lost 70% of our farms. We've lost 45,000 farms per year on average for the past century. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of the things that that does is it creates a food system that is more and more vulnerable. In some ways, our food system is a modern miracle. There's things we got to acknowledge about that. Any type of food, any part of the country, any time of year, that is a miracle. But we have deep, deep, deep vulnerabilities. We've wiped out so many farms, and we have industries that are so concentrated that there are very few ways actually for our food to get from the farm gate to the dinner table. So if you have one great big distribution center go down, Bob, that has an outsized impact on our food supply. When if your wife is looking for certain types of foods, it may well be because, a distribution center or something like that went down, a big link in our supply chain went down. We saw this happen in a very big way with COVID. It happened throughout the whole supply chain during COVID. As the government was shutting down industries, it jammed up our ability to get food from the farmers to the stores and to the restaurants. And we see it also with bird flu. Bird flu, when they wipe out those flocks, because the flocks are so large, it can have an outsized impact on the supply of our food. And that's why we see problems with the health of our food. That's why we see issues where the price of food is going through the roof. All of these issues tie back to that supply chain vulnerability. And in my mind, it's because we have stifled the economic freedom of the farmer and the hardworking consumer in this country.
And how have they gone about doing that? Because we know there's major corporations today that are producing what they call quote unquote food. I would question whether that's actually food in the sense that we'd like to think of it. But you have the Archer Daniels Midland supermarket to the world, blah, 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 blah. Um, but the average farmer, how has he been stifled? What specific things has the
Yeah.
government done?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a variety of forces, and I'll get into the things that the government has done. There are overall economic forces that our country hasn't understood the way economic crises have hit the farmer in unique ways. We also have ways that technology is a double-edged sword. Technology has been moving American agriculture forward. There's also the reality that a lot of our technology tilts the scales against small farms and leaves many of our small farms behind needlessly, I think. But to get to the government policy, which is the third big way, on top of economic crises and technology. Government policy has, for decades, by both parties, been wiping out farmers. And there have been a lot of choices, some of them knowing, some of them unknowing, that we've made where policy decisions have made it harder for farmers to get by in this country. I'll give you a perfect example to answer your question. In the 1980s farm crisis, there's a lot of things that caused that farm crisis. My parents lived through it. We tell the story of them getting married, and they had a drought that same year, wiped out their crops. And they had that happening as they were sailing into the farm crisis. So they had to try to survive a weather related and a financial related crisis. Here's what happened in the farm crisis. We had both parties for decades pushing farmers to get bigger and or get out. One of the ways they were doing that is by pushing government fueled debt onto farmers. They were saying, hey, get more acreage, get more animals, take out this debt to do it. Well, what'd they do within a few years? Within a few years, they raised the interest rates. And the reason they did that is they were trying to tame inflation, just like we were dealing with in recent years here. Now, you can argue for or against, and there can be robust debates on the right and the left in favor of or against government programs for lending, and in favor or against raising interest rates to deal with inflation. You can be for or against either of those things. But when you do both of them, one right after the other, you push government debt on farmers and then you jack up the price. What you do is overnight, you make it impossible for tens of thousands of farmers to make it. And that's one of the things that touched off the farm crisis. And we lost tens of thousands of farms throughout the 1980s. It's just one of countless examples littering our history.
Yeah, well, if you read the Communist Manifesto, which very few people today have, since most of them can't read in the first place, let alone read the Communist Manifesto, uh, there are 10 basic planks. And one of the first planks is controlling the currency. Interest rates are nothing but the price of money. That's all it is. So you lend money to somebody, you charge them for that, and you put a price on it. But under communism, the government decides what that price is. In a free market, which we haven't had for many years, it would be the market that decides prices. For example, Trump this week started imposing price controls to quote unquote lower drug prices. During the 80s, of course, you had the price controls on gas. And of course, these controls always cause shortages and always inflate, just like low interest rates cause people to engage in non economic activities, activities that would not be economically feasible in a market interest rate. So they lure the suckers in with the free money, and then they drive up the rates, as what happened a couple of years ago with the banks. If you remember when Silicon Valley Bank went down and Signature Bank and First Republic Bank, first they had them buy debt, meaning American treasuries, US treasuries, and then they're holding this on their books. You drive the interest rates down, so their balance sheet has to go down, because when interest rates go up, the value of the bond goes down. And they've been playing this game since 1913, when they created the Federal Reserve. And since then, it's basically been downhill with small intervals of recovery. Based, for example, this morning, the 10-year Treasury was approximately 451 to 452. Now it's gone down a little bit to around, last time I looked, 447. That means what's happening is the US Fed is going in and creating money out of thin air and buying the debt, thereby lowering the interest rates. But that's like, putting your finger in a hole in the Hoover Dam. It isn't going to last. And I don't know if you saw that film. It was based on a true story starring that really great actor. It's called Goliath Against. It was the story of what's happening with Monsanto.
Mm.
Um, and the actor is really famous. He was in The Deer Hunter with Robert De Niro, and he was in Jersey Boys. He plays gangsters. I just can't remember his name. It's all about how Monsanto seeds were accidentally flying into land of private farmers. And Monsanto was then going after the farmers for stealing their seeds when the farmers didn't do a thing. And it was called Goliath Against, I just can't remember the name of it. But are you familiar with that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant debate, and there have been a lot of lawsuits around that issue. And the reality is that farmers have always been stuck. And I think that one of the things that I try to make the case to, whether it's government leaders or whether it's private sector leaders, I try to make the case that, hey, look, it has gone far enough. We've lost 70% of our farms. We got nearly 2 million farms left. Most of them are actually small family farms. They just aren't a very large part of our food that's being grown anymore. They're still really crucial, because if we wipe them all out, we're going to lose the rest of our ability to raise food in this country. And I say to people, we can't let farming become too big to fail. How many farms do people think we need? Do we need five? Well, probably think we need more than five, 10, 200. We need thousands, millions. We need millions of farms. And in order to be able to supply our country's needs domestically. And so we've got to reverse this. And so whether it's large corporate players, whether it's individual consumers, whether it's government leaders, I'm constantly making the case that what we need to be doing is changing the direction of our behavior and our policies. We need to recognize that we can't wipe out farms for the future in the way that we have in the past. If we lose farms at the rate of 45,000 a year, which we've done on average for a century, we will wipe out most of the rest of our family farms within the next generation.
Yeah, and of course, family business of all kinds
Yeah.
has always been a way that intergenerational wealth was created, whether
Mhm.
it's in farming or in some other business enterprise. And of course, we all saw, anybody with eyes and a brain, which probably is a very small group, that during the COVID scam, they shut down all these tiny businesses, but Costco was open, Walmart was open, as if you go to Costco, somehow the so-called virus disappears. But if you go to a small little company, a small neighborhood toy store to buy your kid a gift, all of a sudden it's less virulent or more virulent. I mean, how do people fall for this? I remember going to a cheap steakhouse with my wife, and they had a sign that says, when you walk in, you have to wear a mask. Now, if you know me, I'd rather be in a coffin than put on a mask. There is no way I will wear a mask under any circumstances. So I go into the restaurant, and you're supposed to take the mask off when they bring out the steak. So I guess steak creates immunity against COVID. And I started talking loud, saying, look at this, we found the cure for COVID. Just eat a steak and you're not in any danger. And people can't even look at this and say, wait a minute, this is completely insane. These rules: stand 6 feet apart, put poison in your arm, stand online to get 4 boosters or 5 boosters or 6 boosters. It is incredible what is happening.
Well, and the reality is that as it relates to our food, we have the ability to change this. So if you have every American, and I know it's hard to get every American to do anything, we're an unruly people, and in many ways that's a good thing.
I wish we were unruly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe we need to be more unruly in certain ways. But if we could get every American to take a half step toward buying in a way that supports family farms, it would make a massive difference. And that includes, you can go to your local grocer and you can tell them you would like to see some local produce, local goods. A lot of them will carry it if they know that people will buy it. You can buy directly from farmers. You can buy through farmers markets, local butcher shops, to your point about, supporting local small businesses that support local small farmers. And when we do those things, the reality is that everyone will take a half step just to change how they buy their food just a little bit. We could make a massive change. And, the reality is that the American farm family exhibits a kind of resilience that means that they're there, they're ready for it. I think about my dad. One of the stories we tell in the books from the 1950s. That's a time that, as you know, our economy began to be defined more and more by big government and big business in the 1950s, and that's when one of the big eras when family farms began becoming the little guy. Well, my dad, at the tender age of 8, had to step up in that era because my grandpa slipped off a corn crib and broke his back. We talk about in the book how my grandpa got back on his feet, but not before my dad started doing the work of a man. He's been doing that ever since he was 8 years old. He's now in his 70s, so he's been doing that for more than 60 years. And it's that he loves it. I mean, he's right now on the back of a tractor, I guarantee, or he's looking to get on the back of one. And it gets down in your blood and your bones. It's a beautiful way of living. And so I say to people, look, we've got millions of farm families holding on by the skin of their teeth, even though we've artificially made the economics not work for farmers in this country. Imagine what they could accomplish for us if we made it work again.
What is the facts? Because I read a lot of articles about people like Bill Gates buying up an awful lot
Yeah.
of farmland. What is going on with that?
Yeah, there's a number of entities that are out there trying to buy up a lot of farmland. Bill Gates is one of them. There's a few others that I should know. Bill Gates is buying up a lot of farmland. He's trying to convince people that, we can grow our food in a lab. We can live off of worms, like all kinds of crazy stuff. He is part of the group of folks who believe that for environmental reasons, we need to stop people who live close to land and grow food naturally from doing their jobs. I always say to people, if you care about the environment, you should get in league with a family farmer because nobody cares more about the land, abundant water, healthy soil, than our farmers. But in any case, that's one big type of force out there buying up our farmland, and we can't have that. We've got to have small families running. The individual landowner is such a proud tradition in this country. We've got to have many small landowners owning our farms so that they are able to not only produce our food, but have the kind of independence to be able to stand up against some of these other forces trying to buy up our food. One of them is the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese Communist Party is part of a concerted effort to try to buy up American farmland. Chinese investors own more than 300,000 acres of American farmland. That's not a massive amount, but it is growing rapidly. The amount of land owned by foreign interests increased by 15% in just 2 years. And so, also, it's not a surprise to you, Bob, I'm sure, that this is not only about our economic and our food security, but they are buying land near military installations as well. And so, whether it is rich billionaires trying to buy up farmland to do artificial things with it rather than letting hardworking American families grow the food we need, or whether it is, foreign adversaries like the Chinese Communist Party, we have a real problem with farmland being scooped up by people who do not have an intention to grow food in a sustainable way for our country.
Well, I think there's no question that he who controls the food supply controls the people. And all the things that we've mentioned in this interview all relate to control, whether it's COVID, whether it's monopolizing the places where there's food. And if you go, for example, there was a terrific film made about a true story. There was a communist agent named Durante. There's a book about him called Stalin's Apologist. He was an American journalist. He won the Pulitzer Prize, and he went to the Ukraine, which was a tremendous breadbasket prior to communism of farms and produce, etc. And he went there, and people were starving. Millions were dying from government created famines. And Durante went there and wrote false reports saying that the Soviet Union has created a utopia, a heaven on earth. And there was a journalist named Jones who was a socialist himself, but he at least had an iota of integrity. And so he went to the Ukraine to check it out. And he arrives in a village, and there's nobody moving because every single one of the people were dead, many of them frozen to death in their beds along with their kids. And he realized the whole thing was one big fraud. And the Pulitzer Prize that was given, I believe, was to the Washington Compost, the Washington Post. They never returned it. You would think they'd be ashamed that they got a prize for an absolute liar like Durante. And, the Soviets did that because it was control over the so-called peasants. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx never criticizes the rich. Most Americans were brainwashed in schools that communism is against the rich. In fact, communism is absolutely essential for the rich because it makes sure that nobody can ever move up from being poor to the middle class, and from the middle class move up to compete with the rich. So what it does is it creates a rigid class system. And it's kind of like medieval times when you had the lord of the manor and you had a moat around the castle, maybe with alligators in the moat. And then you had a drawbridge. And when the peasants needed to get into the castle, they could pull down the drawbridge, and this would be their means to get into the castle. Now they've removed the drawbridge, which is the middle class, and they're creating this two-tier society. And what happens is they will say, oh, this shows you what a failure free enterprise is. They call it capitalism. I prefer to call it free enterprise. It is not a failure of free enterprise. It is, we don't have free enterprise. It's a failure of socialism. Whatever the government touches, it turns to poison, period.
Yeah. You know, we have seen so many ways that the integrity of free enterprise around American agriculture has been compromised. And you can argue for or against particular government programs. You can talk about uncontrollable factors like weather and how to deal with that and how to put farmers and our food supply in a stable position. But we still need to have appropriate competition. We still need to have appropriate choice. And where we're at right now is that the American government has become so wound up in agriculture that whether people want more or less government or not, they can't really tell which end is up. So it began in the Great Depression and the years afterward, where massive government intervention occurred. And in the years since, we've really just piled one government program on top of another. So rather than assessing which government program is working and which government program isn't, we're just simply piling more of them on and we're very rarely reforming them. So what we end up having is we have a series of government programs, one after the other. It's not clear which ones are working and which aren't. It's not clear which ones are contradictory to one another, of which there are many. And it's not clear how to protect against government doing what government often does, which is become prone to fraud and abuse. And so we have this situation where the American taxpayer could rightly ask, where's my money going? And the American family farmer could rightly ask, where's this support that was supposed to be reaching me? And so we need a bipartisan moonshot to examine all of our government programs and to figure out which ones are working and get rid of them if they aren't, and make sure things are functioning properly and to try to restore as much. Yeah, you've talked about how, there's only certain things that are going to happen, right? We need to restore as much free enterprise to American farming as we can. And if we can marry that with more people who care about where their food comes from, buying their food in a way that supports the small family entrepreneurial farmer, there's a way out of this. But we have to tackle the Leviathan, the behemoth that is our government intervention in American agriculture. There's no question about that.
In the few minutes that Zoom is giving us, talk about the tariffs and the so called Trump bailout that may be coming for farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reality is that farmers are often caught in cross-cutting political winds. And for decades, farmers have been hit by unfair trade. The freewheeling free trade days of the 90s and 2000s, while it opened new markets, and that's a good thing, they didn't negotiate deals that were tough enough, that were fair to American farmers as well as American workers. The flip side of that is, as we try to right that, tariffs are sometimes a tool in that. As we try to right that, and we draw those hard lines that we failed to draw in the past, we have to be careful that we aren't shutting down trade completely with other countries. Because what will happen is retaliatory tariffs from other countries will make American goods more expensive abroad and make it harder for farmers to sell. And that's why you will hear agriculture groups saying, hey, you're gonna hurt our farmers here. Now, where we're at right now is, President Trump has talked about how there's apparently progress with China. That's one of the most adversarial and one of the most unfair and prone to cheating partners that there are from a trade standpoint. There's been talks of the preliminary deal announced with the UK around beef and other things. We need to be striking these deals and we need to be doing them in ways that put family farms first. If we can strike a series of trade deals that are more fair to the American farmer, that can be a good thing and that can be part of the solution. On the other hand, if we don't, if we continue to have trade that's unfair, or if we simply let trade languish and shut down, that will lead to the loss of more farms. So it's a very delicate balance that we're on right now. My hope is that the deal with the UK, deal with other countries, can lead to more fair markets, markets that are more fair than they've been in the past, and that we can get more trade deals. We actually only had about 20 trade deals with foreign countries as of 2022. There are hundreds of countries out there. And so we need to find markets that can be fair to our farmers. We need to strike tough deals with them.
I'll leave you with this thought. In baseball, the Yankees had a very famous player named Reggie Jackson. And there was another famous player named Thurman Munson. And Reggie got in big trouble because he made a statement to the media that I am the straw that stirs the drink. Thurman can only stir it bad.
Mm.
So I apply that to the government. The government can only stir it bad. Anything the government does is bad if it's outside Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which means that 95% of what the government does is illegal. But try straightening that out when most Americans can't even read the Constitution. And hopefully they'll be able to read your book, Land Rich, Cash Poor by Brian Reisinger. And I assume you can get it at Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. Endangered Cash Bar is available on Amazon, anywhere else you buy books online. It's also available in bookstores nationwide. So I appreciate anybody who picks it up and tries to shed a light on these issues.
All right, Brian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Take care.
All right, you too.